There we go. Okay, and how about I will share my screen. I'll give you the Miro link if you want to come into Miro with me, but you don't feel like you have to. Share. And let me give you my link. Gosh, so much house cleaning. Okay, so there's the Miro link, and I'm sharing my screen, and we are going to go right here. And so how many of you did have a chance to access that, all of those materials? But just give me a hand wave if you did. Okay. So maybe not very much. How about, do you want to give us kind of a little overview of what you saw, Micah and Maya? And then we can kind of discuss it.
Do you mean in the open house?
The open house, there's all the data that's been on the Google site. So there's the open house notes and recordings. There's the focus groups, the affinity groups, recordings and notes. Some of the principal chat notes have been on there. If you've attended a coffee chat, anything you've kind of heard from the community that we are going to be processing. They're asking me to move someone. Esther needs to be in.
Well, I did go, I was able to review some of the notes, but mainly I attended the open house. I mean, I listened to it, and it seemed like it was pretty contentious. Like even though people were not able to comment, their comments in the Q&A were pretty clear that there were a lot of issues with equity and just the process and the clarity behind the process, which, I mean, honestly, for me was kind of validating, I guess, because those are things that I have been feeling as well. So that was kind of my takeaway from it.
Thank you, Maya. And thank you for opening the floor.
I read a good amount of the questions. I didn't attend the open house, but I read and there were a lot of questions on there. It seems a lot of people are still frustrated, especially those who are really directly, well, I shouldn't say directly affected. Everyone's directly affected. But I will say, with increasing enrollment in Lane, Lewis Elementary is affected kind of the most. And correct me if I'm incorrect on, in saying this. And a lot of people have questions on, and I mentioned the equity issue. And I feel a lot of people either have a misconception of what equity means or what we're trying to accomplish when we say equity too, right? And that's one aspect. Another aspect is funding. I think a lot of folks, including myself, and I looked at the PPS website and how schools get funded, and it was some material back in 2016 and pie charts and all that, and how increasing enrollment plays into funding, and maybe the next level of just like, oh, each kid in the school gets a certain amount of money, right? But I think a lot of people don't understand beyond that, maybe, and there maybe need to be understanding or more, not understanding, maybe more, a little bit more education on that. And and this is specific to Lane in terms of there's a lot of questions on why it is under enrolled. What's the cause of it, and can we fix that and not have to affect the students and families that are involved in that process? And I'm saying this nicely too. And then there's a lot of CSS questions in Harrison Park. and just, the transition from KA to middle school back to K, and same thing for Bridger. So.
Anybody else? Did anybody have a chance to watch any of the recordings or read over any of the notes?
Yeah, I think I read all 400 plus comments from the open house and, was there. And I mean, it was impossible to follow live, which was quite frustrating. But I mean, I was most struck by what was not said and what was missing. I mean, the comments that I did hear were the same, exactly the same that I've been hearing since this process, since phase one, since this started with any community engagement, which is every school that is faced with change. The only comments were, negative and from people who are unhappy with it. But what was not there was I didn't see a single comment from like a Harrison Park or a Lane parent who felt negatively about changes that were coming. So I think agreed, Andy, the negative comments were kind of like, some probably verbatim from a year ago. But yeah, I mean, and there was just kind of like this repetitive, like, who is actually happy with this? And I want to say, well, actually the process was, this entire process is based on opening a new middle school. And we want to open, we want to have great enrollment and programming at 2 middle schools at Lane and Harrison Park. So yeah, those of us whose kids will benefit from that are happy about that. And I always, I work in healthcare, and it's like I always tell our patients, you research on the internet and you're only going to see, the outliers, the weird, bad things that happen. You're not going to see like the 99% of people who would say it was fine, nothing happened, right? So I think it was just, I was disappointed to not really hear anything new, I guess is what I would say, except continued just kind of just outright opposition to any change.
Are you hearing any of that outside of these specific avenues?
Am I hearing any of like the positive that I mentioned from Harrison Park and Lane families? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I've heard nothing but positive, positive feelings from Harrison Park families about the about changes that are coming. Very like great relief to feel like it sounds like probably we'll have an elementary school actually within our neighborhood boundary for neighborhood kids, because in phase one it was looking like there would no longer be a neighborhood elementary school at all for the neighborhood. So that was very disappointing. So yeah.
Do you think those folks are not participating in these events or because they're happy, or do you think that they are not voicing? Are they participating and not voicing?
Well, I think I've mentioned before, I think there's a lot of feeling that our voices don't matter from our school, and that there was not really much point in participating. There was some feeling that like the things had already been decided early on, which seems to be turning out to not be the case. So, but yeah, and just, I mean, at least 50% of our families don't speak English, so that's a barrier at home. So yeah, a lot of barriers to participation.
I just say so I went to the open house too. I co-sign, pretty much everyone else's read on that. meeting. And I think, I think the takeaway is that at least among the people who showed up at that meeting, there's not a great understanding of the why here. And there's obviously already change is never going to be popular. And so you combine those two things, and I think it explains the general sentiment that we heard. To your question, Marnie, about positive stuff we haven't heard. I mean, I'd say we've had several Bridger community meetings, and I don't think there's a single Bridger perspective on these scenarios, but I will say that, I mean, I happen to be a part of the neighborhood program. I've tried to do some outreach to neighborhood families in particular at Bridger, and I think there's a lot of excitement about one way or another ending up with access to something other than a single strand neighborhood program as a result of any of these proposals. And I think people have different opinions about sort of their preference for how that would happen. But I think there's a lot of appreciation. And I mean, honestly, if anything, there's disappointment that it's still going to be a single strand neighborhood program next year, right? So sort of the same thing Marissa has raised about delaying the timeline from Harrison Park's perspective, but definitely some positive feedback on that front. But I think that's another voice that just hasn't really been part of these conversations.
About anybody else? Did anybody, has anyone talked to anybody? The focus groups were affinity groups. So they were specifically set for the different languages and races. So folks would feel more comfortable speaking out. I think they weren't very well attended. But has anyone talked to anybody who did or had any feedback from that?
I don't have any feedback from those open houses in other languages, but as a Woodstock parent, we've had a number of meetings with some members of the Chinese family, Chinese community that go to our school. So I've gotten a lot of feedback that way. And the voices we are hearing strongly prefer co-location. I think that's pretty well known already though, so I'm not sure that I'm adding much. But that continues to be the preference, the only preference I'm hearing. Eddie, my counterpart in this process, is a parent in the Mandarin immersion program, so he's not in our room though. So he might have a slightly different viewpoint, but I don't think so. Just from the meetings the two of us have had together as well. So I will say that. And the only thing I will add to the general open house that hasn't already been voiced by others is that I really think the community would, as a whole, would be served to understand why the inner Southeast schools are not impacted in a more direct answer kind of way. It was, Marnie, I'm not sure if you know this, you probably do, but we got to vote on the questions at like almost like Facebook or something, like you're liking it kind of. And those were some of the most popular questions. Were like, why are the most affluent areas in Southeast not impacted by this? And so I just want to make sure that voice is heard, because that seemed to be, in addition to the negativity and maybe not understanding, that also was a very common theme among everyone, no matter what school you were from. So
I think the rooms might close. Now we have 15 more minutes. I'm telling them. It's like driving someone else's car when you're running someone else's Zoom room. It's not my Zoom room. Okay. Sorry about that. So I
will echo what Alyssa said, that was, not only was that a question that was asked probably 200 times in the Q&A, but it was answered maybe 3 times, but that portion of the question was deflected. It's like the reason behind it didn't feel authentic, I guess. So
I agree. It would help to have a better answer to that. I will say the cynical side of me wonders, because you guys know that I agree with you on that from an equity perspective, right? Part of me also wonders if, like, some people are kind of asking it in the spirit of, again, just wanting to sort of derail the process generally. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just a way to ensure by essentially, because if we did that, we'd have to start over, right? That essentially means, well, who knows when we're going to get to any changes, right? So maybe I'm cynical, but I think it's a good point that there are plenty of people who are asking it genuinely, and regardless, it would be great to have a more satisfying answer than we've gotten. I think it's probably for the board to answer more than anyone, right?
Do you have a better answer, Kathleen?
Could you repeat the specific question?
Why is the boundary around the change in the southeast where it is? It's left out the inner southeast schools.
Yeah, that I don't know the answer to specifically. I think it was primarily because of the location of the new middle schools. But obviously we all know that there is a domino effect on the other schools in the southeast area. But I was going to share just some input I have received just in my position that I'm not sure if it made it to all the community meetings. I'm the area senior director for the Franklin and Lincoln cluster, but I've served as the Arleta principal for the last 6 weeks simultaneously up until last week. So I just wanted to let folks know the Arleta community, you know, they want to be able to preserve their program and their teachers as much as possible, of course. And then I also just want to share that I have received some emails from Creative Science School middle school students who expressed that they feel much more comfortable in a K-8 environment and in the creative science community than they would in a comprehensive middle school. They argue that a comprehensive middle school isn't necessarily for every student, and they like having the option of having that K-8 option with a smaller community. And I promised them that I would share that testimony. So thank you.
Thank you. It can absolutely be both, and very valid question and easy stick to shove in the spokes. It's true. It's a very common human thing to do. If you don't feel comfortable, then you go and do something about it that stops it. I remember them answering that question too, and I don't remember it well. So Dee, you're asking, can Sam have a chance to talk? You want to?
That was in the main. I think that was in the main room. I think.
Yeah, that was from another
that
group,
came.
I think.
It's like, who's Dee?
Okay,
A brief
great.
detour. She's great. She's a Bridger and Kellogg parent, but yeah,
Oh, fantastic! Not in here. Okay.
Marnie, do you mind? Can I just add one more thing? Is that okay,
Yeah.
guys? Yeah, like other things. One other comment from the open house and the questions and comments there. I feel like there was a good discussion on the Southeast Enrollment Balancing Facebook group about like pitting programs against each other and like how these things sort of started, and about like resentment between the Woodstock and the Harrison Park Mandarin DLI programs. And I was explaining, I think that a lot of that came from like this community feedback in phase 1, where there was just like relentless commentary about how Harrison Park is a bad school, and how every parents were, it was unacceptable for their children to attend this school, and just like really, really negative, comments. And it's really hard, to take all that. And I felt like this time a lot of that was directed at Lane. There were a lot of really painful comments and about Lane, and people having a right to attend the school that was assigned to their home when they bought it, and those kind of comments. So it's just like that doesn't really inspire people to engage in this process, So I think it was like not quite as harsh this time, but in phase 1, it was really bad. So another thing to bring up about like what it's like to participate in this as a parent at a school that gets a lot of comment like that.
And maybe if it started out with some ground rules, that wouldn't happen.
Well, I think it's important for people to. I think it's important to see that come out. I don't think it should be censored, but it's just like it's hard to participate,
Yeah, and recognizing that we all exist and that we all go to schools. I think it's easy to just think of your own school and not other schools as real people and humans and children.
Can I add, so I know I've already, can I just add something really quickly to what Marissa said? I just want to say that I feel like that what we're seeing, where negativity is being flung at certain schools and certain programs, is almost born out of this process. And I don't understand why people who are great leaders, I'm sure, quite intelligent, I didn't foresee this coming. I think it's human nature when you're faced with change to push back against that. And I guess I feel like one way would have been we talked about this at one of our meetings a month or two ago about like building it and then they will come kind of thing. And I feel like the process itself is setting this up to have a lot of, negative feelings towards other communities. And I'm not saying that's right necessarily to have that reaction, but I do think there's kind of a lack of foresight in how this was laid out and presented to the public.
Thank you. So looking at the time, we have about 10 minutes left, and we are tasked with theming some of this. So if you could see, can you see this even? I'm going to pull Negativity Born up here. If you could kind of come up with some overall themes that we've heard from open house materials, if you've read them.
I think I'm seeing a theme about just communities keeping intact, whether it's like at Bridger, there was, the two strands wanting to stay together and not go to different places, whether it's creative science, the K-8 staying together, whether it's Harrison Park, the family staying within walking distance. So I'm hearing a lot of things and looking at program, like if there's a movement of keeping communities intact, like not dismantling communities.
I see a lot of head nods and thumbs. I saw your note, Maya. It does seem to be a flaw in the process that we don't feel like a united community. Oh, she's giving us a 5-minute warning. Yeah.
I think Micah's point about just sort of general lack of understanding about the big picture, sort of why these changes need to happen, or people not being so clear on that. I think I'd co-sign that as a theme. Or did I articulate that well enough, Micah? I think it was you. One of the first two folks who offered that as a theme.
Oh my God. I think the contentious process is a theme. I'm looking at my mural board is over here. Preserve community.
There feels like there's just an overarching lack of trust in the, I wasn't a part of phase 1, but I'm seeing that that's continued through the whole process, is a lack of trust, like that even if decisions are made, they're not going to be honored.
So I think that's a really good one, that the education around the decisions and kind of decisions top to bottom, right? Where the boundary of the change is happening, why the programs are decided the way they are, why the boundaries are the way they are, education around decision and All steps along the way.
And I would put the lack of trust even extends to us coalition members who are representing our communities, but we are, I mean, and I have to say it to a lot of folks, I'm hoping, I applied for this, so in hoping that my community can be a solution in this, not me voicing your anger in why this is happening. And you know, because I'm going to comment like, why aren't you representing us? Why aren't you representing us? And I said, I'm trying to find a solution between the big picture and what works best for our community as well as part of the solution.
So lack of trust in your own community with your representation, or do you mean lack of trust within the SEGC of
Probably
people?
both. I would say both. At least from personal experience, it's lack of trust in me, and that's not from everyone, but there's definitely a contingent. And I think this goes back to their, you know, it's just like the why, right? I don't think that was communicated clearly or to a certain extent in the beginning.
Transparency, clarity. So the theme would be how this plays into high school feeder patterns. When we're thought many people worry about going through this again. Yeah, I'll grab that. And Andy, it's a huge theme. People care as much about the implications for high school as anything we're actually deciding here. So do you think that that's having an impact on people's decision making and their stance in this, is that they're watching where that sends them to high school?
I think that's a big, I mean, Alyssa, you're the one who raised it. I'm curious what you think, but I'd say anecdotally for sure in a lot of cases.
Yeah,
I would, oh,
I think,
sorry.
oh, I'm so, no,
No, go ahead.
No, no, please. No.
I was just going to say that the number one question I've received, and I'm coming from a program that is not affected by the current changes, but the number one question I get is, I'm not sure how to fill out the survey because how will this inform the future decisions at high school?
Oh, I haven't heard that yet.
I've heard that a lot too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Oh, worked perfectly. I'm going to share my screen. Would anyone like the Miro link again? There's a lot of data in here. So you'll see we have our task. We have those worksheets that they talked about. We have the actual rubric in here. Second there. So you're welcome to come in here to look at these. And I'll share my screen. So let me get my chat open so I can see you all. All right. So what we are tasked with is looking at CSS specifically and looking at draft A, B, and C. So the idea of this straw poll is just to see if everybody's on the same page about a couple of these, we don't have to spend time on it. So we're just going to kind of see where our energy, in the amount of time we have, where we want to aim that energy. So let's do it in the chat. This to 5 is usually hands, but let's do it in the chat. We'll do 0 is not interested in this option, and 5 is 100% in, and 3 is okay, 2 is okay, 1 is okay. Then that means we need to talk about it. So the first one is draft A, and that is when CSS goes to Woodstock, is at Woodstock. So in the chat, just give me your 0 through 5. And try not to look at anyone else's, just put yours in there so no anchor is happening. Okay. Okay, so it looks like this is not a go. Looks like it's not completely out of the picture. There's a little, there's some wiggle room in there, but it is certainly not a yes 100% in. All right, let's look at CSS at Arleta. I'm going to make a little line in the sand. So CSS at Arleta, again, 0 is. How do you feel about this one, Andy? Okay. Not a lot of support for this one either. Okay, is that everyone? All right, how about CSS at Bridger? Wait, let me put a line in the sand. There we go. So CSS at Bridger, 0 to 5. Okay. One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, 9. Is that how many of you are there? Okay, so 3 out of 4, a 5 with the condition. So I'm going to put it to you. Do you want to discuss? It seems like you're all kind of on the same page. Do you feel like the people you have heard from are also on the same page? Your communities? Would anyone like to champion or do an elevator pitch for CSS at Woodstock? Somebody who gave it a 3. What are the pros of CSS at Woodstock? So we have Kathy Murray, Michelle Harada.
Marnie, I can throw something out. I have 2 things. First, there's a fun teacher trick called waterfall. I don't know if you know what that is. You ask everybody to put their number in the chat, but don't push enter until you give everybody some time. And then waterfall, they all go at once. The other thing I'm thinking of, the 3 for me is looking, and what I've heard from the families, at room capacity. You know, we're still talking about portables at Bridger if we're going to explain that. So that was one thing. Woodstock has one of the larger with 28 classrooms available. So I think that was one thing. And then also if we look about percentage of BIPOC families and wanting to not impact that, Bridger is, of course, has more BIPOC families than either Arleta or Woodstock, which is less. So that's just why choosing Bridger, there's some displacement, even though I do think seems like an easier transition for the community since that was all, you know, where it's located.
Okay. Room capacity means you think Woodstock has the room capacity for it?
With large, it has more classrooms available, 28 classrooms. That could include neighborhood and an expansion. I've heard a lot saying that it's nice to offer this as a middle school alternative. And so wanting to make sure that there's enough classrooms, if we really are middle school alternatives, to have enough elective classrooms available for more robust, middle school opportunities.
Does anybody else see some pros in the CSS at Woodstock? Any other positives? Okay, I see your cons, Andy, in the chat, and I'll add those.
No, that's not a con. I think that's just a clear. You have to look at the percent excluding the DA.
Okay, so not necessarily a
More a
con,
note.
a flip side.
I think and the other one is a pro. I think there's less display. If I remember correctly, there's less carving off of the Woodstock existing Woodstock neighborhood to.
I don't think that I don't think that's true, Andy. I think that, but I do think that's one modifiable piece for Arleta or Woodstock if they got.
Let's just look it up before I talk. Sorry. I'll pull it up.
Well, I mean, it's hard not to like, I mean, we all work and have lives out of SEGC, right? I mean, I'm assuming I hope we all do. So it's hard to be an expert in every single school, but because I'm at Woodstock, I have looked at how Woodstock and Arleta are very affected by this. But I do think that there's a way that you can not send people to 4 different places, and you can make a more like, okay, you don't stay with creative science because you're not in the boundary any longer, but you only go to maybe 2 different places. So there's a way to, but I think it's equally displacing between both schools actually, in the way that the divisions happen to send the kids off who they're shaving the boundary off of,
Yeah.
which I think is a con for both places. And I don't think it's happening as much at Bridger, but I would feel like you're the expert on that actually.
It's not, and I think that's arguably one of the several pros for the Bridger situation. But yeah. Like I said, I think I gave a lower score than most. So believe me, I'm not trying to push this one.
Oh, even if you are pushing it, it's fine, but I don't get the sense that you are. Anyway.
I appreciate that. So sorry, I was also confused for a second which point I made that you were, that yeah, on the I should have looked at the map before I said that.
Are there any other, what about the other folks who said 3 for this? Any other positives? Does anybody put a higher, is this anyone's favorite proposal? Does anyone think this is the best CSS? I see some head shakes. How about you, Beth? Is this the best one? No.
No, I mean, like the only positive in my opinion would be not forcing the Harrison Park Mandarin DLI out of its neighborhood. But I don't think this is like a viable proposal, so for many other reasons, but that's like the only positive in my opinion.
Okay. And how about the con?
You're talking about the K5 one, right?
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm talking about having proposal A and what it does with the Mandarin DLI programs.
Right. And there's other ways we can address that too. So yeah.
What's the downside, the largest downside of this? Did anybody else give it a 1 besides Andy?
I was being cranky. I probably should have given it a 2 or something. But it's definitely.
I gave it a 1, and
Yeah,
I'll
I did.
stand by my 1. I'll own it. I mean, I think my biggest overarching thing is I don't think that I would hate to see Woodstock's neighborhood program dispersed. So I just don't think that's the way to handle what CSS needs. And I don't think it prioritizes things correctly.
I was just going to add that I used to supervise CSS, and one of the things the families there liked is that it's within walking distance for many of the families, whereas the Woodstock location would take away that option.
Beth, you have your hand up.
Yeah, maybe I'm just not getting it, but I don't understand how CSS can co-locate with a neighborhood program, and then we remove a portion of the neighborhood program in order to allow space for CSS. Okay, I get that. But then we reduce the amount of people that could come into CSS from outside the neighborhood program to, I think it was 15 to 30 kindergartners. Over time, doesn't that eventually, don't we eventually lose too much population because we're not adding people into the school? We've reduced the neighborhood program because we've changed the boundary. And so don't we eventually kill the CSS program when we combine the two?
Not
I
from
just don't
my
understand it.
Yeah, not from my understanding. So Sunnyside still take. So I think that's what we're trying to model it after is Sunnyside's program. So Sunnyside still gets students from outside of the neighborhood boundaries through the lottery. So the seats would remain consistent over time. So, 15 to 30 seats for students outside of the neighborhood each year. So you'd still have, so if typically 60 seats is a lot. Sometimes it's probably more like 20 or 50 because we do about 25 historically in kindergarten. So, sorry, that's all to you.
So if the neighborhood program couldn't offset the difference to get to 60, would you open up more seats then?
For the, sorry. Hold on one second, mommy's talking, okay? Kathleen, can you answer that?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I got distracted by the little one.
That's okay. That's okay. So we say 15 to 30 people coming in from outside, but let's say the neighborhood, in 5 years could only has 5 kindergartners. Do you open it up to increase CSS enrollment?
Yeah, I mean, basically the neighborhood students would get priority for the spots. And then basically whatever's left over would be opened up to outside students, from what I understand.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the assumptions like somewhere where they said like between a quarter and a half of the seats would be filled by lottery long term.
Yeah, I want to make sure there's enough there. The program is sustainable is what I'd like to do, because the neighborhood won't necessarily always have enough kids to support it. But if we don't open it up, then eventually you're going to have tiny classes.
I think you're getting at something that
program's so small.
I think you're getting at something that is also a question I have, but I'm happy to table it because I actually would love to get to the pros and cons of all these and then we can figure it out. But it's sort of like in the transition period, because you're relocating the existing school, that causes the need to sort of shrink the neighborhood boundary. But then how does that ever rebound once the students? That's what I don't quite get the math there either. But I also don't want to take up our 30 minutes going through it. But it is a question I have as well.
Yeah, and I stated it because I think it's a con of specifically of Woodstock and definitely Arleta. And I say definitely Arleta because it doesn't have another program to help offset it, where Woodstock might because of the DLI, Bridger might because of the DLI, and I'm not going to get into the details of those because you all know your schools much better than I do. But with Arleta being a neighborhood only, I think that's where my concern is. So that's why I see a con for these.
So Woodstock and Arleta, it's a con?
Definitely Arleta, excuse me, but I think it also applies to all of them if we reduce the neighborhood boundaries so much.
And I think something to think about, and I don't know how this would play, so I'm just speaking from my experience. Each spring, or actually before that, because it's before the lottery opens up, the schools are asked to give their lottery numbers, and that's based on like their current enrollment or their, or like, sometimes we survey families, like, are you staying, are you leaving? So that might help with that number if we're worried about students, like even the population decreasing, say around that neighborhood or not. I don't know if that helps answer or give more information about that.
I would just want to, and I know Alyssa, you have a question. I just want to follow up on this one thing. I think I would just want to have confidence that like it's so, because there's such a big difference in the numbers with the initial transition, right? I would just want to have confidence that the neighborhood boundary is going to end up so that we really can have it be a predominantly neighborhood school, because that's kind of the pitch for it, right? And then we're going to have like 25% or so of the seats for lottery, but I worry that, I think, Beth, this might be what you're getting at. You're setting it up to actually be a lot more out of neighborhood students than that. And I think some of these work better than others for that, but I just want to make sure when we settle on it seems like we do have consensus on sort of a one we prefer, but I would really I just want to feel confident about the math there, if that makes sense. But it's also not something we have to answer tonight. But does that sort of make sense what I'm getting at?
Is that something you can answer, Ethan? Speak to?
Yeah, I think that it's good to keep in mind that some of the thinking around how creative science pulls neighborhood school students is slightly different from other neighborhood schools. CSS, the capture rate, so that's, you know, what percentage of the students in the attendance area are enrolling in CSS. That capture rate is modeled off of Sunnyside, which has a much higher capture rate than your typical neighborhood program. So essentially, the model is what we're modeling is that a greater amount of students are going, that you're going to get a CSS program located at Woodstock, Arleta, Bridger, and that actually more people from that neighborhood are going to elect to go to that program, that neighborhood program, neighborhood CSS program, than they would just your average CSS or just your average neighborhood program. So, and that's again based off of similar schools, I think like Buckman and Sunnyside, that have that larger. So that's why in some cases like with Woodstock, why you see the boundary shrink so much.
All right, Alyssa.
Are you volunteering, Andy?
Yeah, please.
I have a comment / question, and I'm very happy to be corrected if I'm incorrect in this, but I think that one of the big problems I see with relocating CSS to Woodstock and Arleta, and I'm not as familiar with Bridger, but if you just kind of look at the numbers, I think I get a better flow of what this looks like, is, you know, we keep talking about modeling it after Sunnyside or Buckman, and what has happened when you take a lottery option and you put it in a neighborhood, it's that promotes inequity, right? Like it's gonna drive people not to be able to afford to live in the neighborhoods that like are already barely affordable to begin with. And so I guess I don't understand why, and please correct me if I'm like drawing too many conclusions here, but I guess if we're talking about moving CSS, I feel like there should be some socioeconomic decision and not just pure numbers behind it, because you're just, I mean, I'll be in the boundary for CSS, right? Like I would totally benefit from that, but I don't think we're not the people that are supposed to be benefiting from this whole change, you know, like and so I don't think there's like, it doesn't seem very equitable to me. Also, I worry about the families that really want to go to CSS and can't get in any longer. You know, I don't know, that I have worries about that. So I feel like that is kind of all three potentially, and
Alyssa, I agree with all those points actually, because I've often wondered, you know, people keep saying, oh, it's modeled after Sunnyside, but Sunnyside isn't an accessible program for many people.
Christy, you have your hand raised too.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what was just said, that I think gentrification is something for sure that has been seen in models like these in the past, and something that is definitely a con that needs to be considered, and the impact on those communities. But in terms of the question about the hybrid and neighborhood and kind of what's the long-term implications for enrollment, I think boundaries are very, I mean, they're very nebulous. Like we're looking at a snapshot in time right now, and that will change like as families move and grow. Like it's hard to nail down what boundaries and population will look like in 5 years. We can model and predict, but families move in and out. And I think the one con, if we're looking at trying to ensure that long-term we have that goal of having schools, I think elementary was above 270 to maintain staffing and funding, it would provide that consistency where there can be waxing and waning in the neighborhood population. And because of the lottery coming in, it could create that stability and funding and FTE and enrollment to keep it above. So I think that is a con, I mean, not a con, a pro that allows waxing and waning of enrollment in the neighborhood, and allowing that lottery to come in and help give buffers when sometimes you have a first grade class that's one. And you have 3 third grade classes, and then you have a year where you have a lot of small enrollment, and it just creates a buffer for that and ensures in the long term that those programs or those neighborhood programs are going to stay above that benchmark we were trying to set. And that could be a con for any of those schools. I mean, a pro for any of those schools.
Marissa, and Elisa, I get your names mixed up and I'm sorry.
I think it's Marissa and Alyssa.
Marissa and Alyssa. Great.
Yeah, I mean, I know
Raise
I'm
my
Alyssa,
head.
yes. Yeah, so to address what Alyssa was saying about like about thoughts of what the neighborhood you're moving creative science into. I mean, I think like, yeah, that's the big question is, so currently creative science is located in a neighborhood and it doesn't serve, I mean, it's a difficult thing with any public school that doesn't serve all that all kids are not invited to attend, right? So right now it's in a neighborhood where like not all kids in the neighborhood can attend it. And I think like if the proposal were like, if there were a way to say, let's keep it at Clark and have it, and have the neighborhood be invited to enroll in it as their neighborhood school and still have the creative science curriculum. I don't think anybody in the neighborhood would be opposed to that, but I guess there's just not space to consider that. But and then it would require, changing boundaries and separate and breaking up the Harrison Park neighborhood as it is now, which people don't want. But yeah, so currently it's located in a lower income neighborhood and doesn't serve that population. So the question is like, do you move it to a higher income neighborhood? Or it's like, who is it displacing? So currently the residents of the neighborhood who mostly attend the neighborhood school want to have a neighborhood school. So I think that was the decision that was made, is to give us a neighborhood school that's located in the neighborhood because people have transportation difficulties. But so, I mean, it's like, yeah, then so do we put it in a higher income neighborhood to not displace people who have like more transportation difficulties and then just like perpetuate that it only serves higher income families? It's all I think these questions of focus schools to begin with are all really difficult, right? And it's like, what is the role of this school and who does it serve?
So process check, we've been in here. We only have 20 minutes left.
Yeah.
And we had 45 minutes altogether math. So we have 20 minutes left and we have 2 more options. So let's move to CSS at Arleta. Are there?
Can I suggest that I'm open to feedback on this? Can I suggest we go to C, since that was, I really don't want to shortchange time, since that seemed to be one where people were like, they feel pretty good, but maybe there's some things to mitigate, to make sure we like spend some time naming those, and then we can come back and discuss B, or what do people think about that? I'm just worried we're going to end up with like 5 minutes left on the one that we all thought was the most promising.
Thumbs up.
I can say for Arleta, there is probably a lot of the same points as there is for Woodstock, which is displacing a neighborhood program. So I would agree with Andy.
Okay, great.
That was the context for my cranky -1 million. It's the Woodstock cons just amped up in my book, but yeah, I agree.
Okay, so what are the pros of CSS moving to Bridger?
Well, I would say right now at Bridger, there's only one strand of neighborhood program, which has caused huge challenges.
Yep, there's a programmatic justification for it, like whether this is the one that people would want in a vacuum, but like there's strong consensus at Bridger among the community and also among PPS that the neighborhood program needs a change. And this would provide that, while still maintaining a neighborhood program in the building, or at least some form of the neighborhood program. If pending Beth, your very good question. I think also on the boundary issue, I mean, at least in proposal C, the boundary that would it's the Bridger boundary actually is very similar to, there's a little piece in the southwest that gets kind of carved off to Atkinson, but compared to the change in the boundary you see at Woodstock and Arleta, it's very similar to the current, it's essentially maintaining the Bridger neighborhood as it is.
I didn't see who went first, Christy or Beth.
I think Beth
Chris-
had her hand up.
Okay, I was gonna say, Christy, why don't you go ahead? You're cool.
Oh, kind.
Okay, my question is this is really a question to Bridger and Creative Science. My understanding is that a large current population of the students come from that area of Southeast. Like there's a larger Bridger contingent people in the area, so it would be fewer people traveling. Is that correct?
Actually, Beth, that was exactly what I was going to bring up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right now, if you look at the sheet, there's 75 current Harrison Park students and 44 students that are in the Harrison Park boundary that go to Bridger, and then 75 that go to Harrison that are in the Harrison Park boundary. So it's 119, which is just about a quarter of the population at Creative Science, or either from Bridger or Harrison Park. And I feel like, I don't know that we have this voice represented, but we do have parents that, 75 who are in the neighborhood who feel very strongly that they want access to a focus option in this area, and that, removing this over towards Arleta, where there's already, Sunnyside and I guess Winter Haven aren't that far, that it wouldn't really provide that access at all in this area. And, their feeling is that they can't travel that far. Then that would take that option and access away from them. So I think that is a huge pro of this, is that and we talk about keeping communities together, a very large portion or much more of the community would be able to stay together in that move because of the distance of Bridger. So I think that's a huge pro, is it's keeping a lot of the community and maintaining access for the current families who want.
Micah.
I have a question regarding the capacity. It sounds like if CSS is at Bridger at a K-8 program, then there needs to be modular, right? And if there's is going to be modular, how I know we had discussions on how some of them are just horrible, but how big of a deal is that, I guess, to put in whatever term, that there's modular to accommodate K-8.
I'm looking at Ethan and Misha for that answer.
I can, talk numbers about what it is, but this is actually sort of a question that I have myself is, what is the impact of having children in modular classrooms? Is it no big deal, or is it something that, creates an issue? Because the numbers flesh out with the modulars, but.
I'm not the principal, so I think it probably would be best to leave it to Christy, but my first inclination is like, when I was at CSS as a principal, ranking, okay, if we have to, ranking priority, staying as a K-8 was a really high priority in our decision factors. So I'm guessing, and if I was the principal thinking about, okay, who would be in those modules, probably our older students, and then just being strategic about it. I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker for CSS, and I don't want to speak on behalf of Bridger.
I'll say that that was one of, I think the concerns from the start about Bridger was just the size and capacity to keep a K-8 there. I think the district stance is they're wanting to move away from modular use. And that's actually why it wasn't originally one of the highest considerations, because they wanted to do the balancing without having to use the modulars. I think the community feels right now that if that's, like we talk about trade-offs, if that's what it takes to keep the community together, they're more than happy to use modulars. I think in the long term, the district would like to move away from that practice. And I think they're hoping over time that it'll narrow and we'll just, the size of the school will go lower. I'll say for me, that creates a concern. We go back to the beginning of the, I guess the point of this is making sure that we don't have numbers so low that it's hard to like fully staff and run programs. So if the goal is ultimately to get small enough to fit a K-8 without the modulars, then I think we could be running into the problem that we're trying to solve in the first place, which is getting numbers so low that it's going to be really hard to staff a full K-8. Because right now we're staffed at about 500 for 500 students. And I'll say it's hard. And to do a full K-5 and a full middle school program with just even the core requirements of the state. So if the goal was to eventually get to like 400 to fit in the building, that would definitely, it can be done. It's done at places like Odyssey, but it would be hard.
There's a note in the chat from Maya about the DLI community feedback. Do you mean on option C, or do you mean the DLI impact on on CSS? Their ideas about CSS, about option C.
You're talking about the Bridger DLI community, Maya? Yeah, I'd say there's, I think, consensus from the neighborhood and the DLI that there's an understanding that because we're moving away from single strand, that Bridger can't have both anymore, and that the priority for everyone is that there be some sort of neighborhood program at Bridger if possible. And I think so the DLI community's okay with the idea of the program relocating. They feel really strongly that it shouldn't be split. So like option C specifically does split the two strands of Bridger to two different places. So that aspect of option C is extremely unpopular. But the notion of Bridger, so they'd want to address that, but there's not an issue with the idea in a vacuum of having Bridger retain a neighborhood program of some sort. Does that help?
That's a con.
Right. I don't know that that's necessarily, I mean, to me, that's something that's like, well, that doesn't necessarily have to be inevitable in this, I would assume. Like there's other than, but yeah, it's definitely a con if for some reason there's no way to,
if we took
it's a con of C, whether it's a con that flows directly from the creative science being a Bridger, I'm not sure.
The idea isn't that it's A, B, or C. It's trying to figure out the best option. So that's a great note to have.
I would just say I hear you, Christy, on the size, and I mean, for what it's worth, I think Bridger community does feel pretty strongly about wanting to not be reliant on the modulars, or at least relying on the modulars where it's like, however they're being used is most kids, some kids are there like all day versus I don't know if there's a way to use them for, you know, other rooms, like not core classrooms. So I do think one way or another, if we were going to pursue this, we'd want to get a more detailed analysis of sort of what the realistic long-term state would be with the modulars. But I mean, again, I think this is another one where I would love to, I'm going to be a broken record. I would love to, my hunch is that we were talking about relocating creative science as a K-5 at Bridger. It fits almost perfectly, right? And I know there's TBD whether we get to see what that looks like, but the numbers suggest to be right at 80%.
You have your hand raised, Beth.
Well, if I remember correctly, one of the charges from phase one was to reduce the, or basically work the numbers around so that we could get the kindergarten at Bridger back into Bridger, because there was way too many students and not enough space. It's, you know, it's a smaller school from a classroom size. And so we did that. And now we're mixing it up. And so I think this is a con. We're mixing it up by putting creative science and making some adjustments and having to use the modulars. And so I just wonder at what point are we basically redoing, are we messing up what we just did in phase one to help the school by putting too many people in the school again? So just bringing that up, because I don't know, there weren't a lot of people here from phase one. So
all of them have a con of Bridger just converted to K-5 this year. This would send it back to K-8. Con for all.
And that's the same for Arleta also.
mm-hmm.
And Woodstock's not a K, but I mean, it would, the configuration's not, I don't think they're eager for, that I've heard.
And
what,
this is the one that you all liked. This is the one that scored the highest.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel really frustrated with like, I mean, I agree that it's a con, of course, like going back to a K8, because that's what we're trying to get away from. But I feel really frustrated with any argument that about like making another change when we just made a change last year, because it's like, this is what we were set up to do when it was decided to have phase 1 and phase 2. I think personally that was a huge mistake, and like we can't, yeah, unfortunately, I don't think that's a factor that we should be strongly like weighing here. So, but yeah, I think, as far as capacity and avoiding modulars, and that it would be ideal to have CSS, the K5 at Bridger.
I will say on that though, at least in the case of Bridger, Marissa, like it's not just the reconversion, like there actually was a strong desire in the community to, and I know, and so I'll stipulate, obviously I know anyone would be able to opt out of CSS at middle school and attend a conference at middle school. I think that's important. However, the community very much wanted to move away from the sort of default small middle school thing. And so, I mean, I think it's that element of it too, given just sort of the feedback that we heard in phase 1. But you're right that it's partly a consequence of how we structured this, which I agree with you on.
Misha.
Yeah, it's more of a wondering, which could be a pro. When we talked, Christy was talking about the amount of students a quarter are drawn from Harrison Park or Bridger. I'm wondering how many of those students actually are our BIPOC families at Creative Science. I feel like the percentage is probably pretty high that we pull from, opposed to families coming in from outside those neighborhoods. But just thinking about, sorry, I'm just saying faces of kids I know, and thinking that they're from within those neighborhoods. And so if we could keep them in within a walking distance, I know a lot of them do walk, I think that would be great for them. And I don't know if great qualifies for very much, but.
Oh, it's this one. And Kathleen.
This I'll do on behalf of the Arleta principal and community. Is that the one difference, we didn't talk about Arleta, but there is a difference between Arleta and then the Woodstock and Bridger options. And that is CSS would combine with Arleta, which would put over 700 students in that building. We have just around 300 there now, and almost every single space is being used. So in order to accommodate both the schools completely and to increase Arleta to a K8, they would be extremely packed classrooms. I'd say probably in the 30s, 35, possibly more. And currently we also have an SES room at Arleta that actually uses 2 spaces because of the need for a de-escalation space. We have rooms that are used by Morrison Center because our students are highly trauma impacted. We have specialist and instructional specialist classrooms. So there are lots of spaces that aren't necessarily used as fully at other sites. But in the past they were in closets basically when the school was a K8. So I'm not sure physically how 700 students would fit, and we'd still be able to provide those community services that all those additional services that are currently serving the Arleta students. Just logistical.
And I would add to that, and maybe actually Kathleen, maybe you know this because you were there recently, but a question that I've had throughout this is those social emotional classrooms, that program, does it even get to stay there under proposal B, or do those kids get shuffled up? Because those kids are some of the most sensitive, high needs kids in the system. And that's been a concern of mine all along.
Yeah, and I should hope so, because those we have a very good mainstreaming program there. The teachers are extremely adept at mainstreaming, and I actually see the students there mainstreamed more consistently than I have at other school sites that host focus programs. There's just a deep commitment there.
Just higher level in that one. I mean, all I got to do is look at the map to just see how much of the current Arleta neighborhood is just carved off to other places and split to different schools. It's just, I couldn't, I don't see how anyone could support that as a fair.
And even carved off, like Kathleen's saying, it's still, people still won't fit properly.
Right.
Even with all that, taking it down to
even with that,
50%.
yeah. It's just, it should be a non-starter in my opinion.
I do want to address that a little bit just from the community feedback. Because of the distance of both Woodstock and Arleta, a large portion of the community would not be able to make that move. So I think the idea of trying to find a space for all 450 students is highly unlikely. A very large number of people would not be able to make that move because of the commute and the distance. So because a lot of people, we're right on that border of Northeast and Southeast. So we have a lot of families that commute from Northeast, and it just would not be realistic. So I think that's something just to know that it would not be the whole school. It'd probably be a lot less. And in the models I saw about the social emotional classroom was to remain. And that actually is something that is of inclusion as a big part of creative science. Like we were piloting co-teaching at kindergarten and the middle school and trying to move towards more of a full inclusion model. So actually that's something that I think was why they were looking at the SES staying.
Good question, Alyssa. Is CSS staying in this boundary of these schools, or is there an option of it to go into a Northeast school or in or Southeast? Or
I feel like when this was brought up, how long have we been doing this? A year more? I feel like when it was brought up, we did look at other locations, and then it would cause a ripple effect like it's happening in Southeast. I don't know if that answers your question, but there wasn't just like an empty, we tried to see like empty buildings, empty spaces, small programs, like in the entire, in PPS. And Kathleen, I think you. I was just saying that Kathleen, I believe you were there when we thought initially started thinking like, what are options? What's going to be the least disruptive if PPS or CSS needs to know?
Actually, that was something that was brought up in my community in response to the board meeting last night of saying we already have 2 schools in Southeast, is that Winter Haven and Sunnyside are more deep Southeast, and really creative science is right on the line of Northeast and Southeast. It's like right on the border. There really isn't any other focus options in this area, and that both, I think the Woodstock and Arleta moves, I think one of the cons of that is it kind of pushes it more in that area of Sunnyside and Winter Haven where there already is 2, whereas Bridger is still in the area that we're already in where there isn't already programs like that.
Well, Arleta isn't very far from 82nd. It's very close, just on Holgate and Foster. Yeah, it's not very far at all. It's much closer than Woodstock.
And this is my principal hat, not just new hat I wear, just I think about our K8, the K8 at Creative Science, and I'm think about, and as in this new position, like, right, I'm thinking about what are our options for our middle schoolers. And when I was a principal at K8, the middle schools, I don't want to say we were an alternative program, but I felt because of like our high SPED population that we were a step between our comprehensive middle schools and those alternative programs. Like for families that needed something that wasn't either of those options, Creative Science provided that. And as Christy mentioned, CSS is pulling a lot of students from Northeast. I think looking for that smaller school option.
So when in voting, the pro was very much CSS at Bridger. Are these weighted? There's not as many. Are they weighted heavier than the others, would you say? Walking distance, minimal boundary changes. It's currently only one strand. What are the big reasons that this is the one you're leaning toward? Is it because of the cons of the other two?
I would say another pro, just from what I've heard in the community meetings at Bridger, and I don't want to speak for Woodstock or Arleta, I only know what's sort of been reported secondhand, but there's been, I think for this to work, there has to be a level of receptiveness from the community that CSS is going to be merging with. And I believe that there is in the Bridger neighborhood community, based on what I've heard. I think we need to do some more work, especially to hear from some of our higher need neighborhood families in particular. However, I've detected a noticeable difference in tone in the way this has been discussed in the Bridger community and the level of openness to it than what I've detected from, from some of the feedback we've heard from, certainly from Arleta. And I'm not sure, I don't want to speak, Alyssa, for the Woodstock community, but I have a feeling it wasn't extremely positive coming from them either. So I do think that's an important pro. And I think it's sort of that combined with the idea that you can actually make a programmatic case for it, right? It's not that CSS is like the solution to what Bridger needs in the neighborhood program, but like there already needs to be a change in the neighborhood program for programmatic reasons. So it's like, I think that's important.
At Bridger.
I do think clarity on the modular question is going to be important for at least for the Bridger community. And I think it leads potentially to the question about the K-5 thing, but I know that's a separate thing.
Do you want to discuss any pros at Arleta, or we all just know Arleta?
I will say there is most of the community at Arleta, at least who attended the community meetings that I held and everything, were against CSS coming because they want to keep their community program and the current programming they have. But I will say there is a group of parents who felt less comfortable speaking out publicly, who were in support of CSS coming into Arleta, simply because the school has had a lot of administrative turnover and some turmoil over the last few years. So I want to make sure that I'm representing all voices of the Arleta community, because there was a small contingency that reached out and wanted to make sure that their voices were heard also.
Okay. Not a 5 because Bridger doesn't have enough space. Otherwise it would be. If it was bigger, if there was space, it would be a 5. Alyssa, do you think it would be a 5 if it was big enough? Does that seem to be the major con, the size?
For me, I think I'm having a really hard time looking past the community acceptance. So I feel like Andy seems like a very good representative of the Bridger community. And so
and Andy is saying this as a for better or for worse noted, frankly, skeptic of and so yeah, I mean, I'm trying to represent honestly like I'm hearing.
Yeah, so I guess I feel like I could be a 5 on it if people affected don't care about the modulars. I have no opinion about modulars. Like, I'm a midwife. I have no clue. I don't know. So I don't have an opinion about that. And if the community is receptive to it. So if the community wasn't receptive to it, if the DLI folks were like, no, then I wouldn't be a 5. But